Hello everyone, today we talk about early Imperial Roman combat, that is to say an introduction to the Roman battle experience in this period, including a bit all the various arms involved, in spite of the fact naturally most of the video revolves around heavy infantry combat. You know that from last winter I started some miniseries about about Roman warfare in general, right, from archaic times to also not later times yet, but we'll arrive to it, and I have in parallel other series in the bigger cosmic cycle, Schwerpunkt, that every once in a while just are meant to deal in detail with basically every aspect of Roman warfare throughout all the various eras, as much as, further in the Middle Ages, in the Byzantine period, and beyond. Early Imperial Roman combat is just like one of the top topics ever, right? I guess that on YouTube you can find plenty of that. You know that I have my own method, my own quite a lengthy way of taking care of such topics. And in fact, again, this video is specifically just an introduction to some things that we will have to look at much more in detail. Just to make an example, the pilum salvo, right? That requires just an introduction regarding what we know, what we don't know, what are the hypotheses, abstract models, practical issues, right? All things that we will deal with in another video, and then we will make another video about the pilum, and actually multiple ones, because the pilum evolved over time. So that at least if you have been following me for a while, how I work, right? So these are just broader introductions to eventually add all various tacits, other bricks to the wall structure. And needless to say, we will talk about kind of a general engagement, contextually, like not necessarily, it can be mostly like a large scale open field engagement, right? But we can get to smaller issues, so it's a mix of tactics, of kind of training, of weaponry, of combat psychology, and other issues that I'll try to blend all in something unitary. So looking at this pitched battle, let's put it this way, fought by an early Imperial Roman army that is technically at the top of at least its previous history, quality, kind of properly of not necessarily of aggressiveness as the individual legionnaire, but generally speaking, from a collective point of view, literally at the top of cohesion, of moral strength, and kind of discipline and equipment and so on. So this is the most famed military machine of the ancient world, if not of all history. And it deserves a consideration that goes a bit beyond also the fact that naturally the Roman army fought in actually similar ways, if not basically the same ones, of basically any other sedentary people of the time, except again it was more developed, was more performing, had a higher quality, and the reasons for this I discussed widely, as you know, in other videos you can find in the Roman Warfare playlist, that explained the reasons of such enhancement, right? Part of that is civilizational, but as you know, within it there are some broader spiritual considerations, kind of, just experience, right? Rome at this point has century-old imperial experience, conquests, counter-insurgency, strategy, the integration of many other elements in the army to actually make it to the top of that. And it's not, in fact, as you know, much that changed the game, rather what happened to the citizen core on the longer run that made the thing, because Rome was definitely extremely successful in exploiting properly the potential of all the elements of her armed forces. And as I was saying, the latter observations are necessary to understand in the first place why we talk about Roman, not just military, but also moral superiority that people have ever greater difficulty to understand nowadays, because moral superiority is sinking in the same way nowadays. And I will not explain myself further in this video too, because I literally discuss this stuff for hours and hours again, and the videos I make every day are not the only ones that exist. There are all the others that I've been making for all these days, so people could simply move up a bit and go check the playlist if they are curious. And as I was saying before, when you look at, say, the essentials of Roman combat, you realize that this was carried out according to pretty uniform kind of standard, if you want, conventional schemes, right? There wasn't anything particularly different from a technical point of view that Roman heavy infantry did on the battlefields that other peoples did, except they were better than the others at doing that, which is really how in warfare most things really get down to. So the first convoy, very simply, we're again just introducing the broader concept, that pitched battles, especially larger engagements, and in general this was true also for smaller ones, but began with some preliminary engagements, right, that normally broke out at first contact with the enemy, right, and normally with lighter troops, the ones that had been screening, scouting, exploring, where the heavier force would have had to go through. So the larger engagements began generally, as we know, with a thick throw from the side of light infantry and cavalry too, as we will see now, of missiles, right? That is to say, mostly javelins of various type, and again we will talk about this on another occasion, but the Latin for it is usually tela or missilia as plurals, arrows, the sagittae, and even stones, the saxa, right, which are different literally from the sling projectiles, the glandes, that is the nuts in clay or lead that naturally have a high specific weight and are pretty darn good at even damaging armor and whatever is underneath it. But battlefields also in substantially advanced times in terms of military art like this, but still in the Middle Ages, right? So the employment of very rudimentary means, right? Literally stones, right? Stone, like just even today, you would be surprised perhaps how frequently this happens, especially in kind of fortified scenarios at close range and so on. But it's as simple as effective mean, and at the time also was pretty much used by anyone, again, from the more primitive to the more advanced peoples. Also because the projectiles could be found everywhere in this sense and were immediately available. And all this missile fire was naturally aimed at disorganizing and disorienting the enemy array, right? Tacitus talks about this, for example, in his Histories 5:17. I mean, the fact that, of course, when you have all these lighter elements that are also jumping around back and forth, carrying out hit-and-run tactics, you can easily distract the enemy accordingly from which direction the core of the forces or your forces are coming. Right? You may never know. We've seen this tactic actually on multiple occasions. Right? This could be carried out from, again, small units, like from entire armies that could literally, especially the ones of the steppes, right, that were mostly based, aside from the shock, the very narrow, quantitatively speaking, shock element by his swarms of horse archers, literally screening an entire army that the enemy for a while would not even know whether it was just there or 200 kilometers away. The Romans coped with this, as we've seen in the videos about Julian's and Antony's expeditions in Persia. We will come back on that. However, it's pretty known history and tactics and strategies, telling the truth. And the role of lighter troops, which doesn't necessarily mean light troops, right? You know, the difference standing in whether these troops can take on the field proper. Like a light element is the one that at the advance of another of a heavier one has to retreat, right? So sometimes in the Roman, like in the Latin literature, you find terms like levis armatura, which means light armor, which doesn't necessarily just mean lighter troops, because some of them were also actually assault troops by some degree, at least. This depends, because the term here specifically refers to armor, right? But the say armor in Latin, in this sense, can mean a more broadly speaking offensive panoply. So we do find the Roman, say, heavy infantry often engage also with lighter equipment in tasks like, I don't know, amphibious operations, assaults, whatever, situations in which they had to be paradoxically lighter than heavier, even though the risk was greater, because sometimes speed is more important than protection, right? So you have to be able to distinguish what kind of tactical situation this concretely was. And there is, generally speaking, also a cliche that we discussed in other videos about the idea that auxiliary troops would be constantly kind of lighter than the Roman citizen infantry, right? This in part is true, meaning that of course the Roman legionnaires had properly a privileged status. They were the superior race that had to properly have all these other subjects paving the way to their intervention. We've seen videos like the Battle of Mons Graupius, in which, however, the Romans employed auxiliary troops as fundamentally the main battle line, at least the first battle line, right? Just like as heavy infantry. And while it is true that on average we can absolutely expect in the Roman army the auxiliaries to be more lightly equipped than the Roman legionnaire, this doesn't mean, however, that the auxiliary forces couldn't be in turn equipped with very heavy arms and armor in the same way the legionnaires were. And there is actually some substantial evidence of this, also for obvious reasons, because if you know, what are these auxiliaries there for, right? Are they just a military complement, or are they also something else, properly troops sent by the subject peoples, volunteers that are there for, you know, achieving a broader goal, right? These people are the ones that Rome can spend more easily, because there are many, she is sure, basically, that come from areas that that are not the core ones of the empire, and that have much to earn from this condition to improve their future, and thus you can easily spend them even in the hardest tactical roles that can be, in this sense, also the one in the first battle, right? That is not necessarily the weaker, right? The legionnaires may just be there essentially watching while the auxiliaries make most of the work, the dirtiest one. And that is actually the case of the Battle of Mons Graupius, when we've seen that basically the Caledonians are crushed exclusively by these mostly Germano-Celtic auxiliaries that, in terms of infantry quality, were quite high. And then, of course, you would have mostly lighter troops in other roles. Just think about, again, the archers, mounted skirmishers, etc., that are just lighter. They mostly come from kind of fringe areas where, again, the fact that there is a lot of missile warfare is not per se an indicator of great civilizational development. It means that most of your troops skirmish. They're not good for standing ground, right? So they can't cope quite with the bulkier, in fact, infantries of the great sedentary civilizations. But as far again as screening, skirmishing, exploring, scouting, whatever, these are the best. Think about Mauryan cavalry, or in all these various archers from the eastern regions, not necessarily Syria. I made a video specifically about this, but once generally speaking influenced by the steppe cultures, that would be also bringing their own technicalities in the empire. And naturally we do have evidence of the fact that some of these auxiliaries were properly still equipped with the native gear, and this means that not all of them were literally given by the Roman army everything they needed. Everything was much still more customized than we think, right? We have an idea that also that the Roman legionaries were all equipped all basically in the same way, right? The point there that was just the standard of essential elements like an armor and a shield, a helmet, a sword, and some javelins, but the nature of each of these pieces changed significantly, and the combinations could be very, very varied. The same legionnaires could actually buy other weapons. They would go war like that. They could receive weaponry, also fighting in faraway lands from the local allies, or even of course using the enemy arms. So everything was much more diversified than what we have usually been thinking. Just think, yes, on average, the Roman citizen had the better equipment, surely the better training. They were at this point still probably the ones that had were exalted about the role that their people had in the universe, let's say. However, there was this constant kind of injection of fresh elements that had yet to prove that, and that gradually, as you know, would be fully integrated, would begin citizenship and so on, and contributed dramatically to the expansion of the same empire, right? As they had been subjugated by the Romans, they also, however, managed, if serving Rome adequately, like extending their own control over other peoples by becoming Roman citizens and contributing to this broader machinery. So it's obvious that some, the nature of skirmishers and of missile troops in general was varied, right? Properly, the cheapest elements were the skirmishers, the lighter troops, the javeliners, if you want. The Roman army never threw troops away just per se, because in general they cost anyway. However, particularly prized were the archers cohorts, the cohortes sagittariorum, and other specialized units, especially of javeliners and especially slingers, which could inflict dramatic damage on armored units, respectively, in siege and in kind of open field warfare. The latter especially, slingers were in ancient times considered even superior to archers, while javelins, again, even in times of great armor development, even later on in Middle Ages, as the stones were actually extremely effective anti-armor weapons, especially again in siege warfare, because of the relative advantages presented by the fortifications for the defenders, and the close range, the bulkier dart that would mostly aim at the joints of the armor. So things were not dramatically different actually across the millennia here. As you know, the Roman army during the late Republic had fundamentally gotten rid of at least the velites, as essentially citizen skirmishers, as a class on their own, the lowest one, the poorest one. Most of these lighter elements had been again substituted by foreign troops. This is true also for cavalry that had decreased in number, at least as a legionary complement, because in the Middle Republic, in the Polybian army, at least the Allies provided with pretty substantial amount of cavalry, quantitatively and qualitatively. The cavalry complement in early imperial times had gone down to a few hundreds of citizen cavalry. That was actually quite good. The Romans were actually always very, very careful about the quality of their cavalry, what usually passes for less than some other people, but the only point being that it was less numerically, but actually was pretty darn good, and it was just easier for Rome to draw horsemen from many other populations, like the ones again of North Africa, Spain, Central Europe, etc., that performed, as you know, in the cohortes equitatae, and there were also mixed units. In any case, the point for this video is that, of course, Rome could afford all the broader array of specialized troops that very often, of course, given the professionalism of the Roman army, the kind of the imperial control, the fact that it was well supplied and properly stationed in kind of pretty functional ways, could intervene even with impressive concentration of forces, not much of numbers, but properly of quality, right? At some point, some were show-offs, like the siege of Masada, right? For a handful of Jewish rebels, you would send an entire legion, right? Properly to show the entire Near East that if Rome wanted, could simply spend a disproportionate amount of forces just to crush even a nest of rebels, right? Naturally, there were larger engagements, mostly when you look at the Roman conquest campaigns. They hardly ever had any numerical superiority. Mostly, the largest the campaigns, the greater, the more balanced the odds are numerically and in force, generally speaking. And actually, it's fair to say that Rome conquered most of her empire in constant numerical inferiority. Operationally speaking, again, so this is not the point. Rome triumphed in ways that weren't about sending tons of troops to be slaughtered by some allegedly more heroically qualitative people. No, right? The highest quality was by far the one of the Roman army that mostly conquered much larger amounts of people, subjects of territories than the ones she was operating from. And this is yet another thing that I think at least some people have a sort of cognitive dissonance with, for which they cannot accept it, because they must somehow demonize anything that is Roman, because they cannot accept, again, that the world doesn't get the way they wish it went. That is, tradition is properly from the side of empires, not the ones of tribes. And there is a specific reasons why empires are empires and tribes are tribes, and why empires conquer tribes, for that matter, and make them also something better than tribes. The distance at which it was possible to hit the enemy depended naturally on the arms used. An arrow shot by a composite bow could reach a distance of more than 200 meters. However, the useful shot, that is to say the one capable of inflicting meaningful damage, was on average of 80, 100 meters, right? And similar distances were achievable with the sling, while the light javelins could hit distances normally not greater than 35, 40 meters. We'll see it also with the pilum that, as you know, was of two kinds, right? The lighter one, in fact, was thrown mostly at that distance, the bulkier one at a closer one. And it, of course, gives you properly an idea of also what it meant to approach an army, whichever it was, right? Because basically all of them operated in the same way. The closer you got, the more stuff arrived at you, and the harder, it was. The performance naturally was different in the case of throwing machines. The useful range reached could surpass also the 300 meters in function of the power of the machinery. Flavius Josephus, in his Jewish War, describes beautifully the measures were used according to the type of target, the distance, etc. And we never made a video about this aspect in particular, as it is important to stress that throwing machines were mostly employed in siege warfare for obvious reasons, and also in relatively limited ways. I mean, mostly these machines had been born to take out towers, single cannon, in fact, other catapult emplacements and things like that. However, these throwing machines throughout all their history in ancient medieval times did see an open field, a pitched battle even, employment of some degree. Again, this was naturally less relevant than in siege warfare. However, it could really produce a true preparation fire for the assault of heavy infantry, with especially heavier repercussions on the morale of the enemy, right? And there are some interesting passages, such as from Tacitus' Annals, to 20 cases of literally, some chieftains that had been literally transpassed and impaled by ballistas shots on trees, etc. And again, the ammo was limited. Again, the pieces cost a significant lot, right? So that there were also few in general. Just they put an extra strain to the army logistics and supplies, and so on. However, if concentrated on a single section of enemy ramp, because of course also in open field you could have some sort of field fortification, right? Battlefields are not basketball fields. There can be farms, orchards, some embankments, whatever. There are beautiful examples of this exactly in Tacitus, stories during, for example, Germanicus' campaign against the Germans and so on. And you had to dislodge sometimes the enemy, especially from forests, from areas where, that could be dangerous if not preemptively kind of swept for making some other troops enter in it. Naturally, the best troops to cope with these situations were still, again, skirmishers, lighter troops that could harass especially enemies that in that instance are fundamentally on the defensive, because they have to shelter themselves. But again, the display of Roman force, also just psychologically seeing this monstrous giants. I mean, just think you are, a German, you see for the first time in your life, not just Romans building a bridge across the Rhine, which is something that is beyond basically any technological capacity you can even dream of. But these kind of, balls that shoot, massive balls or darts that can, maim multiple people at a time is definitely frightening. Is definitely something that makes you also even reflect on how that can mechanically happen, but that may have in fact more moral impact than the physical one, because naturally the amount of people killed by these machines was far less. We're talking about probably hundreds times less than the normal, and extremely bloody, because it was nothing else but exclusively plain butchery in terms of hand-to-hand fighting in the ancient world. But paradoxically, again, it was more terrifying. There are other instances. Also, the Romans, from their primitive background, had gone through the thing. I mean, when they faced the Indian elephants of Pyrrhus, they were frightened by that. They preferred to throw themselves on the Macedonian Saris side and waiting for the elephants to outflank them or something, because it was scary. They were not habituated to that, and in any case, all these tricks wouldn't prevail on the type of army that Rome was engineering, that we've seen also recently, right? So in many ways it's anecdotal. The Romans in early imperial times were also Hellenizing by a degree culturally, so they adopted a bit of that kind of Hellenic technologistic idealism, for which considered that most military engineers in this period in the Roman army were coming from the Hellenistic world, right? The Romano-Italic legionnaire, also the ones for which, for example, the Gauls that were being Romanized and providing with substantial amount of troops both from the Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, we're just living in a more primitive world, right? The West, the Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Iberian was another thing that compared to Greece, and most of the technological advancements that also the Romans made in those centuries were still notoriously on the base of Hellenistic technology. And again, this wouldn't be as spectacular as still today can seem, also because we had adopted as children of the Greeks scientifically, technologically, from a mental point of view, that kind of hype. These are some of the least relevant aspects of warfare in general still today. Always remember that technology without doctrine doesn't have any relevance. It's completely useless. It's better not to have it, right? Doctrine is everything. Technology is zero, right? So there was naturally a broader objective of kind of getting the better hand over the enemy during this preparatory phase of skirmishing, right? But if that had been sufficient alone, the enemy would have not maintained his ground, would have not set forth for battle in the first place, right? So obviously these were just preparatory engagements, and mostly were inconclusive, right? They didn't have any practically decisive effect, except they could help shift a little bit the balance, and as we will see now, also properly testing what the general morale of the enemy really was, right? How eager was the enemy to fight, to engage, right? These initial skirmishes were still somehow a sort of omen prediction what could happen in the broader one, and they were just a safety measures also to literally give the time to troops to deploy, to line up, right, which was a delicate phase where, of course, the formation was more vulnerable because it was literally, being made up, and was a given amount of time that you knew, even though these were light troops, that it would take to shoot them, right, and to eventually arrive to the heavier element. This is not all, because we will see that during properly the engagement between the heavy infantries, of course, the skirmishers kept operating, as much as missile warfare continued from the sides and times of the same heavy troops, right? Because most of the battles were literally just skirmishing and this big pauses between engagements that lasted just some minute, that was somehow exhausting at that moment. It was a bit of back and forth. Battles could last for an entire day or more, depending, of course, on what the forces were, the terrain, whatever, what was the strategic objective in the first place. In any case, this phase was not, in fact, just let's say, seeing the action of light troops. Sometimes also heavy ones, in the form, in part, of the same, again, heavy infantry that could be provoked by a bunch of lighter troops and they could chase it, right? It's not entirely wise. In fact, there was always, as we'll see now, kind of disciplinary norms that we're aware of these, for these armies. Always the injunction not to leave, not to abandon your unit. You're always remaining in the line, because the enemy was trying to do exactly that, to provoke you, so that if you break the line, you would essentially just follow your blind instinct of an individualistic warrior, not the one of a brutally disciplined, in fact, and trained soldier. And this made great part of the difference, actually, between the army of an imperial civilization and the one, again, of a sort of warrioristic tribe, and to naturally cut them down, right, attracting them somewhere where it was easier to just finish them, and so on. So that's why it was imperative just to stick together, right, and to make mass, to not to be surrounded, and so on. And in this preliminary phases, also cavalry engaged, right? Cavalry was not the decisive arm among the sedentaries, thus, infantry was not broken by it per se. You needed at least the enemy line to be engaged with another one, to be routed by an outflankment or a rare attack carried out by a cavalry force that could simply get past the enemy line. In any case, most cavalry acted on the wings, exactly to try that encirclement, and symmetrically speaking, you would find mostly other cavalry on the wings that was doing the same thing. So there was also this kind of cavalry engagement that was very important for the outcome of the battle later on. We've seen it in various battles that, this especially in ancient history, you have a lot of chasing, normally, of lighter troops. They were properly, like at the Battle of Zama, for example, you find that the Numidian cavalry retreating to avoid the heavier Roman cavalry to be able to come back undisturbed against the Carthaginian rear. They would finally, come back after having gotten the job done. We were looking at it about Iberian warfare some week ago, when we noticed that the ancient sources noticed that Iberian cavalry was heavier, say, even than the North African one, could reach it and kill it. So also the myth that the cavalry of sedentary, at least of heavier peoples, that couldn't chase the lighter one, the skirmishing one, the one that carries out the Parthian shot, is actually not true, right? And generally speaking, civilization stands from the side of the heaviers, right? Because you can't afford in the first place to go at war like that, right? Warfare is always asymmetric, but conventionally, the heavier you are, and the more you can bring as not just material but moral force in the first place to move that on the field, and that means you are actually the stronger force, and withdrawing, retreating, giving ground, feigning flight is just a proof of strategic inferiority, right? You can't lead to successful outcomes, but that's because the situation is balanced by other factors, including the ones that you also always fight with a heavier bulk, even if you have a smaller one. But on average, that surely is not a positive indicator from the side of the lighter one. Um, so we've seen this testing the enemy, verifying the consistency, the motivation, etc. According to Vegetius, we quote now also authors like Caesar, Vegetius from times that are not still clearly imperial, but we know actually a few about the Roman army, and you would be surprised by how few is, especially about the early imperial one, for the simple fact that it was kind of so much the standard out there, was just dominating the world, that nobody even needed to talk about it too much, as opposed to the moment of Roman rise, when there were other external observers that wanted to explain in a more critical way the thing. So Vegetius 2:17 says, quote, the javeliners, the skirmishers, the archers, and the slingers, that is to say, those lightly equipped, provoked the enemy by disposing themselves in front of the array, right? So normally, yes, lighter troops were, as we've seen, properly in the front of the battle line, as properly light troops, right? On the flanks, you would have lighter troops than the bulk of the heavy infantry battle line, right? But still heavy cavalry mostly, and or also other more mobile, slightly lighter troops, but still heavy, that could again hold the ground against the other heavies that could come, right? Differently from these skirmishers in the front, that in fact were not properly arrayed in a formation. They were just in open order, skirmishing, going back and forth, and also when the enemy closed in, withdrawing in the gaps between the various units, because again, they were all scattered. They acted individually mostly. I mean, there was also a cohesion there. Of course, if you had, let's say, a cohort of archers, you wanted them to still, given that they mostly carry out zone fire, let's say, to, of course, concentrate them. The problem is that the enemy could send heavier forces like cavalry or even infantry to chase them, and this could create problems. You had to watch out not to expose them so much, not to concentrate them so much, so that they could also scatter more easily, not to be caught by the enemy that is mostly just concentrated on the frontal attack with the main force, right, and vice versa. So this is also partly the advantage of, say, getting out of the way while the main engagement starts and starting to harass the enemy flanks. If you can make it to the enemy flanks, there aren't other equivalents of yours on the enemy flanks as well to keep you away. So everything was much more symmetric, notoriously, than we know, and that's why there is not like the intelligent people and the dumb people that make war. Right? If you are too weak that you can't hold the ground, you simply do not even go at war. Politically speaking, that's what happens. So continuing what Vegetius says, if these could put the enemy in flight, they would pursue them. If instead they were pushed back by the numbers and the value of the enemy, they would withdraw and dispose themselves, in fact, behind their comrades. Right? This would go on, as we've seen, back and forth for a consistent amount of time, especially between the engagements of the heavier forces that would come close, distance themselves, kind of maintaining the order, not to collapse, because that was the most important thing. So these lighter troops would literally intervene complementarily to help distancing the enemy by attacking aggressively in a moment. Just it's lighter troops, but they can inflict this nasty losses just at close range, while the heavy infantry is gradually withdrawing, and so on. This happened again also among other peoples, right? The withdrawing, maintaining cohesion was very important, because that's the moment in which, if you turn and flee, you're the most vulnerable, right? Even some elements can, including exactly turning your back to some kind of skirmishers that is around, can take out even a heavier trooper, right? So we know of I don't know, the Germans pulling away from the battlefield, their wounded, maintaining the cohesion, the thick order quite withdrawing quite gradually. We see the same Romans had kind of ready medical aid for people that got wounded. Naturally, the front line was a hotter place that prevented any kind of broader sophistication aside from plain butchery, as we were saying before. So, but consider that it is difficult to kill a person directly at this time of technological development. I mean, today you can shoot a person even from 100 meters away. You blow their brains out. They're done. That time, in order to kill a person, yes, you could get, I don't know, an arrow in the eye, but don't think even that, you can easily just see the person collapsing on the spot if that happens. And the wounds, most of these troops would receive lots of wounds before being effectively taken down. Some very serious ones that are mortal wounds you can't keep fighting on and living on for a very long time. And there was naturally also a different psychophysical level of pain tolerability by some degree, right? Some of these forces were, again, mostly even the Roman army. They were farmers. They had been rising in the countryside. They knew how to live out there in the wild, how to to erect fortifications, how to find food. They knew how tough things could get. And generally speaking, the training the Roman legionary underwent was the equivalent of an actual combat, right? Except for less bloodshed, but they were traumatic experiences designed exactly to destroy the human being and to rebuild it in a military machine, right? Fanatically exalted to properly slaughter the largest amount of human beings as possible. And naturally, these troops were pretty darn good at that. In the case in which the enemy battle line was not giving sign of yielding through simple skirmishing, lighter troops withdrew to leave room properly to heavy infantry. That, as we've seen, was traditionally constituted by the legionary cohorts at this time. Naturally, today we do not talk about how many battle lines existed, were different arrays, and so on. We just, we have described these things also in other videos. They were not so dramatically different, aside from the difference in the various arms development from, say, medieval times. Conceptually, we will see it even in the phase of the pursuit, etc. Everything was just calibrated on the base of reserves, of in fact, reinjecting this fresh troops as much as the enemy could, and hoping to have the upper hand at the end of the engagement. However, the heavy troops were properly the ones that would decide the engagement. At least it contributed to it the most. Always bearing in mind, in fact, that at this point the art of war displays combined armed tactics, right? So infantry and cavalry fight shoulder to shoulder, not literally, but at least as arms. And this is pretty much the case everywhere, right? There isn't a people that fights just with one arm, or even if they do, in the sense that they're particularly relying, say, on mounted warfare. Still, there is a combination between lighter and the heavier troops, and these mechanisms somehow take on different character. Naturally, as we've seen with also the case of the Roman forces, I mean, cavalry could dismount or remount, whatever, so the same heavier troops could carry out different tactical roles from at least the main one for which they were designed. This depends on the single battles. We still have to go in depth in kind of most, in fact, Roman warfare to describe these things from engagement to engagement historically, but we will hopefully with time. So this was the moment in which the enemy had to be prepared enough for the main engagement. Hopefully, you would have tired him down. You would have exhausted part of their forces. You would have cooked him, prepared for the arrival of this formidable heavy force that was dreaded in the world, headed by the virile heavenly principle of the eagle, and of this, in fact, transfigurational heroic capacity of the world conquerors. And it meant literally to be tested at a metaphysical level, right? Warfare requiring all the possible resources and the perfect combination, let's say, according to a wisdom that must be properly the traditional one. So there was pretty heavy psychological component to this all. The world had fundamentally bowed to the achievements of the Roman legions, recognizing that whoever this new people emerging from a relatively primitive area like the Italian peninsula were, they had topped kind of properly the divine deal, right? Had essentially conquered the world and deserved through arms that was the only international role recognized at the time, such unchallenged superiority. And whoever wanted to challenge it instead had to be aware, of course, of how Rome was willing to go, right? The advance of the legionary units happened in a first phase in slow way. Again, this was also normal, but for all heavy infantry, they would not tire themselves down with a kind of a rashy behavior. They had to maintain cohesion. They had naturally been brutally trained to do so. They were coordinated, silent, right? This, in other peoples with less political cohesion, was more complicated to achieve because, say, if you pick, I don't know, an average barbarian, say, Central European population, normally, the capacity to offer a significant resistance depended on, in fact, how motivated they were, right? What kind of quality their leader was, if he had managed to, say, give a reason for all these troops to stand together, given that they were still all commanded by different chiefs that came from different places, that had a very loose, if any, kind of common identity. And these populations didn't have the political and social systems to put in common enough surplus to invest in a centralized government that could provide with, in fact, the degree of harshness and discipline necessary to forge a professional military, to maintain it over time, to maintain the conquests, etc. So this could translate itself in the field was a definitely less coordinated and kind of more messy formation that, however, had nothing to do with some kind of stereotype that also exists about the barbarians, as if they didn't have an order, or they were kind of all scattered and irrational, whatever. They fought pretty much in the same way, like everyone. They had cohesive, thickly packed battle lines in which they basically placed and especially in a usually in an immediate kind of single charge, because they didn't have many ways to maintain the field for long, because again their political systems could not afford that. The supply systems were more primitive, so that's why they aimed at all this big loud single charge, right, to break the Roman array, right, and sometimes also succeeding in this, except happening less often than not, given that that is generally speaking not enough, or especially if you make a coordinate use of reserves, and you maintain cold blood, and you know what you do in the formation. You have practiced that endless times, so that it's become almost like immediate, natural to do. You are, again, as the Roman sources said, battles were just some training, which a bit of more of a bit of blood was spilled, and technically speaking, that's what happened, especially in moment of combat, as of course the wide majority of the killing happened when the enemy broke, and especially again in a mostly a sanitary world where you have all these heavy infantrymen concentrated in a single place. Once the line breaks, you can simply send in a marginal amount of say cavalry, lighter troops to chase them, given that they're psychophysically broken, and essentially slaughter them like lambs. Right? We know properly that at some point when you have given everything, you just let yourself being killed. Like there isn't even much awareness of the the possibility of doing anything else in that moment. And of course, war is a clash between moral forces that reciprocally influence each other. It has barely anything to do with technology, with even with numbers by a degree. By all these things are important; they make up the thing. But the main deal is spiritual. The main deal is how much you hold, right? And this is what training and discipline were meant to do, because you would have not been pleased with having gone through a Roman training, right? As you would have not been pleased to go through the a warband selection, with the only difference that the earlier was, however, broadly speaking, aimed at making things work on a broader collective scale. The latter mostly was designed to boost kind of an individual capacity that could be, let's say, effective in a one-to-one context that, however, is not the one of the major strategic engagements, down to any other meaningful one getting the worst of it more often than not. The idea of concentrating forces properly to the last was crucial, right? Discipline teaches you to do that. It's not just about, what you can easily see even in reenactment, in HEMA, etc., that every idiot has the capacity of throwing himself against someone with all the force he can. There's literally no military value in that, right? Because it doesn't take in consideration any form of rational engagement just per se. What really makes a professional military is being able to keep all your self-consuming emotions, instincts, fears, whatever, down, so that you do not burn your energies until you have arrived to the moment in which you have to unleash them, and again causing immense slaughter, which is the only purpose of any military. The only one. It's not professional opportunities, it's not some kind of experience. The only purpose of the military, for which we should thank God every single day, is killing the largest amount of people possible. And civilizations have these things very clear in mind, as it is the most logical, rational, positive intelligence that you can have in a military situation. Naturally, in order to do that, you have to train, right? The Roman legionnaires actually do display, still at this time, because again, they are much less modern and secularized times than ours, so all characters of warriorism as well. There was some of that, right? The Romans were very well aware of the fact that you needed discipline and virtus at the same time, right? And that the perfect balance between the two, the perfect interaction between the two, made the world domination. They had mastered that, because again, they had been conquered for 400 years uninterruptedly in a row by this point. So this was just a developed function that had brought to the results that we know, and they knew better as a as a military culture. Consider that in Latin there is not even the equivalent for the term strategy, but still these men were able to control a space, by the way, with a minimal amount of troops, as we have seen in the videos about Roman strategy. And just because they had, of course, a spiritual body that was supporting them in this, matured through this, through the military religion that is even useless to qualify because it was the only universal, in fact, religion existing at the time and shared in the rules by everyone. Right, being defeated meant there to be broken properly in front of God. You lost the possession on yourself, and this was again the entire all the peoples in the world believed exclusively that the stronger had to rule on the weaker. And objectively, it's very difficult to find another logic to existence. I mean, if you are strong and somebody else is weak, the question is, why are you strong and why the other person is weak, right? We give it as a basic situation, as if the weak could be still kind of a better person. Really? Because the stronger must have gotten that from somewhere, must have put a lot in that. There is actually a pretty positive concept, principle in all of it. So the stronger has, in this sense, the capacity just to lecture the weaker about the reason of his inferiority. You do not conquer to literally kill everyone. You conquer to rule over other people. This is the point of universal empires and of again, on the divine power that every polity believed, and in fact any force could come from. And it seems valid absolutely also today if we hadn't been, again, properly deprived of any kind of traditional knowledge and reduced to a bunch of nationalistic and socialistic mess that doesn't even know where to start from in educating themselves or having any kind of human dignity. Never mind that, it gets down to materialism at the end of the day, and basically the direction is the same, right? The question is how much you're willing to keep losing over and over as a person before you realize there is something wrong about that. Well, studying history gives you all the answers for that matter. So there was something definitely ancestral, kind of metaphysical and highly spiritual in the entire way that the battles are designed in the first place. So how humans fight against one another, what is that they're basically trying to get from it. So also in fact the psychological impact of having this fiercely drilled force that advance coordinately and silently and bears also a degree of uniformity that shows that people can even care about that you're fighting against a people that is so powerful that can simply afford to have this with incredible, again, moral standards in the first place, is just per se disheartening, to say the least. And seeing these guys unleashing hell in the moment, which, as you'll see now, they would reach the useful distance for the pilum throwing, is something that a very few at this time had even the desperation, I would say, to test, right? It was crucial, of course, there was all a functionality in this. First of all, of course, you're going to unleash all the forces at once, which is the best way to do that strategically in the first place, being the strongest at a given point. That's just sheer logic. And naturally, the compactness of the formation, so the order during the advance, is crucial for this too. And silence is as crucial in order to be able to listen to the orders. You will notice that the Roman helmets, especially the ones of Imperial Gallic form that are very protective in many ways, have this pretty big holes for the ears, And yes, it was much more vital to be able to listen to an order, and this tells you how drilled and tactically responsive the Roman legionnaires were, then risking having a sword stuck in your brain from the side of your hand. So this tells you all about probably the degree, also what we cannot unfortunately reconstruct about the complexity of at least the tactical procedures that the Roman legionnaires were trained to perform. Because as we will see, especially the pilum throwing was a crucial moment, right? Was the one in which the attack was properly unleashed. The useful range of a pilum of lighter type is likely not superior to 30 meters. Vegetzius 3:15 says that the legionary ranks advanced at this point by maintaining a distance between each other of at least 6 feet. That would be something like 180 centimeters, in order to dispose of the necessary space to throw the heavy javelin. Now, this distance is quite meaningful because, as we will see now, Vegetzius from the 4th century states that legionnaires had a pretty close order as far as the lateral space between legionnaires was, right? A sort of phalanx, like 30 centimeters, just the space for thrusting at that point. The spada, that was actually technically more slashing, and of course Vegetzius gives this measure, but we do not actually know how what kind of order a Roman legion had throughout all these various centuries, because it wasn't standard, right? The only measure, this is to tell you how few we actually know, that we have about the Roman heavy infantry order comes from Polybius, that instead describes something that is almost an open order in the 3rd to 2nd century BC. So there would be a lot of interesting considerations to make about this, but we will skip for other specific videos in which we'll talk about battle lines and all this stuff. However, the fact that it would be the contrast between this narrow space, according to Vegetzius, between the side of the legionnaires and basically the height of another legionnaire, between the various ranks in depth, tells you how still for by the 4th century, where of course the Roman army had actually increased its missile potential, but the pila at least were used less than, at least in the way that we can document previously, and there are lots of doubts. Again, we're mostly going by by hypothesis here. Tells you how important was properly the space to throw the javelins, and how much it had remained in the Roman army. This was done on the move, by the way. We do have some info about, mostly from Caesar, a couple of lines that suggest that the pila could be thrown also from a stationary position, and maybe before an attack, but not at the same time. However, in fact, most of the pila throwing happened coordinately in movement, right? And especially in these few seconds, actually, before the impact against the enemy lines, that tended to attack each other by charging, right? If one of the two sides had just stood firm there, waiting for the enemy charge to arrive, it would basically lost the capacity of countering the charge with their own power, right? This is valid for infantry as much as for cavalry. For cavalry, actually, even a bit more, because cavalry cannot properly defend at all when it stands firm. But infantry is charged one another, and it was important in this sense to time all the movements, because you needed enough space between the ranks, but you also needed eventually to close immediately the space between the ranks to form a kind of a push from the posterior ranks to maintain the formation more compact, to avoid enemies entering the same formation and kind of disordering it, and disrupting especially the first ranks, that were the ones, by the way, made up by by the better men that the others were trained to follow. These were all, we think that the men sharing, same contubernum, 8 men in a tent, were also part of they made up literally the file, right, of, in fact, what we think normally 8 men was a common depth, an average one, if you want, in the ancient world, generally speaking, even though it could be changed. We don't have at least we don't have to be categorical about that in general. So it was crucial just to time this perfectly, and that's where the Roman training really came to something. We'll see this in hyper detail for what we can think the thing may have worked like in another video. But it was all timed on the base of throwing essentially the first javelin when the enemy arrived at 30 meters. So the light pilum was designed exactly to throw that. And the interesting thing is that this thing was so fast and consequential that it happened as a continuous throw of also the posterior ranks, right? So the first 2 ranks would mostly see where their pila would land. The ones from the third, the fourth, was not were just they were probably also the only ones the deepest ones to be able to throw the pilum would just follow the centurion order, counting on the fact that they even if they couldn't see where the pilum would land, which target, they knew where it would, spatially speaking, and the centurion knew that, could eyeball that, so that they could even just give this blind throw and still hitting someone, also considering how thickly compact, in fact, the infantry formations were. This happened in sequence, and by the time these posterior ranks were throwing their light pilum, the first ones they were ahead, and in the meanwhile the space was between them and the enemy was becoming narrower. The first ranks would start throwing the heavy pilum. That was a bulkier thing for a close range, probably to smash more heavily on the enemy formation. Now, all this was, again, coordinated and simultaneous. The Roman legionnaires were trained properly over and over and over again to maximize the effect of the attack. In this sense, it produced a massive, energy release, and so that it could probably not be avoided by the enemy in the first place, would be invested by the shower of heavy javelins that, if you count just even the amount of this in this simple numbers of the equation on the front, would make say every 40 square centimeters of an enemy front, shield, face, whatever, being hit by a pilum each. Right. This means that, let's say, if you pick an enemy line of 10, at least 2 or 3 were knocked out before hitting the enemy line, and let's say a half of them altogether would have had their shield basically rendered useless, right, by the amount of pila that were stuck into it. So this, in order to compensate for the disorder of the progressivity of the pila, was also functional to the because they would have been more functional to be thrown all together, right? But what this was functional, that this gradual launch was functional to, actually, was the fact that during the enemy advance, the pila would arrive gradually, so less impacting in a single place, but still essentially hitting on a greater amount of ranks, also in depth, and giving thus the time of more people within the rank to fall, and so to give more time just to cause a sort of obstacle within the advance, and disordering the enemy formation on a greater amount of time. In order to fix that, you would have had to stop from the other side and composing the ranks, but that's exactly what would have placed you in a further condition of inferiority, because you would have had to withstand the enemy charge instead by standing still, and so losing a lot of power in the meanwhile. Thus, you could just imagine how somebody that would finally arrive against the belligerent forces during this charge would just think how long would it last before they would collapse. Naturally, the enemies would do similar things, right? We don't have such significant amount of details that sometimes are also not so direct or explicit for as the ones that we have for the Roman army for other peoples, but they likely did the same thing, right? Heavy javelins were present among all kind of the heavy infantries of the ancient world. They were normally used, employed. Again, also in this, the Romans didn't quite differ much from the rest of these peoples, except they had a much greater collective training that allowed them, first of all, to perform dramatically better this tactic on average, and that also kind of practiced this long enough to develop an ever more functional type of weaponry, right? The pila were not so always standardized as we think they were. There is a slow, gradual evolution. I was talking about that, for example, in a video about 4th century Italic warfare, when you start seeing properly this kind of double javelin specializing itself also within the context of the Roman conquest. So it would be very interesting to confront this with other people, such as the Gauls, that were just there to using the Geism, for example. So again, the equipments were just very similar. The Celts and the Italics historically had basically the same weapons, like pretty much anyone, because they were very close to one another. What we usually say the Romans copied, let's say, from the Celts, actually it's minor forms. For the rest, the essentials of arms and armor had always been the same. There is not a kind of a moment they found out that they could use a heavy javelin or a sword. It's sometimes of the same length that even some Roman copies had, compared to some Latin swords as well. And, the difference between a curved or a straight sword in practice is irrelevant. The same goes for the scutum. They were already there, right? And they're actually Italic weapons as far as the source. The Romans just had them standard pack from then a Celtic borrowing that again was also pretty much the same people, even in origin, back in the mist of history. So this moment was crucial because it literally showed who was the better unit, right? If you were able to perform under stress, under fire, because the Romans were under fire while this was happening as well, so they had similar problems from their side, but would still be able to carry that out or more orderly, mechanically, naturally, and effectively, would have in hand-to-hand combat such in the ensuing melee such a dramatic advantage that it could just immediately solve the engagement per se, right? And this kind of back and forth occurred to the point where, of course, if this were talking about a century or a maniple, because they still existed in early imperial times, telling the truth, at least we don't know much about them from a tactical point of view, but we know that they were at least administrative units, and they did correspond, after all, to the same units that had existed before, and cohorts, right? This doesn't mean that every century now could simply open itself any way within the enemy ranks and simply cutting the enemy army across in 1 minute, right? So battles were pretty big things. You understand that most of how they were designed was settled by the macroscopic interaction between the various arms. But definitely in a moral sense, facing an infantry that can carry out this type of tactics with that degree of systematization was definitely just an important moral factor that could lead to mostly a negative outcome from the other side. So, as we've seen, just after the pila throwing, the proper and true assault took place, right? The terms used by the classical authors, perrumpere, prorumpere, invadere, give probably a clear idea of the characteristics of rapidity, of dynamism, with which the charge after the pila throwing was carried out, right? Perrumpo, prorumpo, etc. These are invado, are literally violent concepts that speak about the disruption of the enemy, say of a target, the intrusion into it, right? So properly the idea of tearing an enemy formation apart by just smashing through it and cutting and all this stuff. And this was naturally easier mostly in early imperial times than it had been in likely against, for example, the Macedonian armies, because those we know had never quite been broken frontally, and even in early imperial times, even against this other kind of mostly the standard is the Central European infantryman, you wouldn't quite just be able to break through again an enemy unit that's simply, but again it was a matter of unbalancing as much as you could the engagement as soon as it began, right? Because again, the greatest amount of force and the one that would cause the greatest amount of damage as far as the order of the enemy formation was carried out at that point, right? And again, the engagements would just follow through with some dynamics that had mostly profiled themselves since the beginning of this engagement. Now, a Roman legionary would likely now charge with the gladius just in hand, and at that point running to increase again the pilum throwing happened exactly in movement, right, in order to increase the speed, and also again not just to provide the javelin with more kinetic energy, but also to reduce the time they would spend under the fire of the enemy javelins as well, right? That was crucial. Then at this point you were just think about it. It's not easy. You have to be already in the condition of unseating the sword, charging, staying focused properly with the guy that you have already spotted. You will have to attack in front of you to cut to pieces, and maintaining again cold nerves in this situation, which is terrifying, right? Again, what you can see the difference between professional and professional units is that the least experienced one will just again throw themselves rashly against the enemy without even thinking, right? This is properly what also some of the least developed peoples really did. They intoxicated themselves with alcohol. These things I was just reading about yesterday about the fact that the Nervi, for example, that were considered by Caesar the finest people among the Belgians. First of all, the finest tribe among the Belgians that were also the finest people in Gaul, militarily wise. Despised people who intoxicated themselves because they said, for war you have just to be clear and lucid. And this is true, actually. We know that for how much drugs was actually used during wars, like during combat, you don't actually use that because it dramatically decreases your focus, and it's simply something you cannot afford, right? There's, for example, no evidence that during the Vietnam War, that during combat, people dragged themselves back in the trenches, in the camps, not while they were actually just potentially shoot someone while they were high, right? So the idea of focus, of lucidity, of not properly, of being, also having faith. You have to have faith on yourself, and being able in yourself to be able to carry this out, but you also have to have faith in the rest of your in your comrades, in your army, in your commander, and ultimately in the spirit that was leading the same legions, right? And it was all one with that. It was just part of a great spirit manifesting itself in these charges. So normally you would charge in this way, sword in hand, for 20-25 meters. And the most important thing was trying to maintain, in spite of the increased speed and force, like alignment and, in fact, cohesion with the rest of the unit, right? This would make it easier also to exploit the disorder, the disorientation, disorganization caused by the pila throwing in the enemy lines. And the more compact you would have remained, the more easily the guys that had remained kind of either to ahead or to below would have been overwhelmed, because they would have not had enough people on their sides to help them or whatever. In the enemy lines, as we've seen, the fallen in the first ranks had hampered the movement of the posterior ranks, even before coming to hand-to-hand combat. The pila had pierced the shields, and this just per se would cause a slowing down of the movement, so causing for a brief instant a condition not just much of disorder, physically speaking, but probably of moral inferiority. Freak out. Imagine you're loading yourself for that kind of hypercharge that has to decide everything, to decide everything, and you must stop for this thing that is so apparently ridiculous, but that is literally bogging you down. Even if all this had not happened, still you would have had to smash against some enemy unit, right? But with an increased speed, again, they would run against each other, and just the impact of two humans running into each other is not that few, especially considering they had gained speed with a significant extra weight made up by the equipment. And the Romans were dramatically skilled in hand-to-hand combat as well. This aspect is somehow underrated as far even as the individual capacities of a Roman legionnaire, where the fact that the gladius, aside from the fact it was not the only type of sword used even at this time, because the spatae were already there, and arguably they had already been there since ever, right? At least since the Latin types had spread in the Roman army as well, and or there were, as we were saying before, just blades of even 70-80 centimeters from archaic times at the same time. So the capacity also of the average enemy that a Roman legionnaire would have had to meet with, given that at least we're talking about legionnaires, and auxiliary force would have been different in that regard, but were lower than a Roman equivalent. A Roman equivalent, or even a superior, could be found in a very elite force, like, I don't know, properly a nobiliar troops that were just even superior in single combat, right? At some elites all over the world, really, to single legionnaires were, but not necessarily to centurions or other, or picked bodies of some sort. That would have been the Roman equivalent of that instead. The majority of enemies, at least for the legionary, would have been like again a guy with a shield, a helmet, a sword, couple of javelins, and probably not even a body armor, right? And given the Roman equipment, it wasn't necessarily always the same, right? We think again every Roman legionary was also uniformly armored. This is not really known, right? We can't think like in any army that was an elite concentrated. Usually we think in the first cohort it was probably also better equipped. As we've seen, also auxiliaries at some point could have been provided if they had to carry out certain specific tactical roles with heavier armor, right? We don't even have to think that per se, for example, this so-called segmented armor was superior to mail as such. First of all, they were made of very different materials and quality of, and secondly, they were pretty much equivalent to one another, telling you the truth. What mattered here was, in part, the degree, of course, of the quality of the troops that were employed in combat, because there was naturally always a preference for the elite, right? At least from the skirmishing troops, that there was probably a place of honor that had to lead the way from both sides. Well, also the enemy normally faced the Romans with the best troops in the front ranks, aside from the skirmishers that were a bit like the boys, the youths, the squires, things like that, and then for skirmishing. And again, most of the battle was done by these elements. They were the more combative, the more aggressive, the more bloodthirsty, the more experienced. And so the ones on which the core, that represented the core of the army on which the entire force relied, practically, on. So there are lots of debates regarding how, again, the spaces, the measures, the distances. We just don't know them. I mean, by a degree, it's even useless to discuss them because it's so speculative, and we're talking about half of a millennium of history that, frankly, we can't simply imagine how heterogeneous it really was by a degree. In any case, when you look at the Roman legionary panoply during the early empire, you have at least the idea of more or less what Roman combat could get down to. Spaces were not particularly broad, right? At least the fact that swords had gotten a little shorter from Republican times, and also the say armor had increased, and so greater protection for closer combat had manifested itself also for closing in with shorter weapons, suggests that spaces were narrower than at least they had been before, right? And that, given also the nature of these swords that were absolutely capable of cutting, but they were definitely better at thrusting, most of the hits were carried out mostly with the tip, the mucro in Latin. Germanicus recommended multiple times his men before clashing against the Germans, and Tacitus in his Annals 2:14, 2:21 talks about this, to hit them in the face, right, with the tip of the swords. This was, a good tactic, generally speaking, because, even if a blow in the face may not be mortal, still it's able to knock out the fighter instantly, right? The Germans were not particularly armored, materially prosperous, so again, maybe they were also easier to target in the face for that reason. But you see that also in the Roman helmets, fundamentally, again, the face is uncovered, and most helmets historically are, because it's much more important, again, to see during the fight than to have your face protected, and this is particularly important. The effect was also psychological, because the instinctive tendency to protect the face induced to reduce the defense in other very vulnerable parts. For example, your lower belly, where important vessels are present, the armpits, the same neck. At least there are different ideas on how these were essentially the most vulnerable points, were also, in fact, less protected by armor in the first place. Seemingly, a viable move was also to incapacitate the enemy by crouching and cutting his tendons behind the leg. There have been some broader, suggestions of how this kind of also Roman versus Roman combat could happen, right? For example, the voluminous, the pretty large neck guard on the back of the head. It's been said this is mostly what legionnaires had to protect themselves from blows from cutting swords like the ones that existed in Central Eastern Europe abundantly, and blows from cavalry troops, whatever, from the bow. But if you think about it, if you grapple with an enemy, you would also tend to, if there is the scutum in between, you would tend to kind of slice the neck of the person from the behind. So lots of things can really happen. Panoplies are designed basically to cope with any kind of problem, and they are meaningfully protecting some specific parts of the body, which is not just about the balance that exists between also how much weight you can carry, right? There are manichae, there are greaves, there were some Roman legionaries who were incredibly heavily armored, also beyond the kind of the popularized versions of the basic armor that they could have. And again, there was an incredibly varied difference. We will treat this when talking about Roman arms and armor, as we have already done in part. It has to do also with probably where you think most of the hits would land in the first place, right? Of course, of how more dangerous it was to target parts of the limbs, while kind of in this sense switching the balance from the center to the sides of the target. So these are all things that, again, people in HEMA and in other reconstructions tend to test empirically, right, amateurally, and what they think, generally speaking, Roman combat could be about. The point is that we're not mentally designed like a Roman legionnaire, right? So the degree, for example, of physical exertion and resistance, and and properly of mental aggressiveness and habituation to manslaughter, it's something that would change the entire way a person fights. So trying to test it from the 21st century, pretending that you just being dressed up like a legionnaire or whatever has any relevance, scientifically speaking, regarding to these matters, is first of all properly not understanding anything about the essence of warfare, which is overwhelmingly moral in nature, right? And secondly, again, you're not definitely a person from those times, even just physically speaking. You're not fighting in a formation. You don't have a clue on how to dose your energies for further engagements. You're just like an idiot pushing another one dressed up like a Roman legionnaire. And I've seen certain things on the internet that are utterly ridiculous. I mean, the sheer physical weakness of a bunch of guys that poke each other, of course with unsharp weapons. What's even the point of doing that? Right? That's ridiculous. I mean, if you want to put up a show, do it, but don't pretend that you're actually the hero who's reconstructing how it has this deep, hardcore, true, earned, deserved understanding of ancient combat or combat in general, because that's just like a buffonade and nothing else, right? And military historians look at you thinking, what to the degree of, how low your IQ can fall, right? Just looking from the way you're trying to sell this stuff. We all understand that you're selling that, but this doesn't mean that it has to be garbage and people having to buy it for some reason. So as you know, I've always been very vocal about this because I happen to specialize exactly in this field without pretending to be like a know-it-all, but a minimum methodological standard in scientific research is like the first thing you must provide without any possible excuse. And if these are the premises, you start doing these things, you can simply keep doing what you want, but at least not pretending people not to ridiculize you or mock you also because of many other reasons that frankly bring people to get in these activities in the first place. But I will not talk about this, at least in this video. Just be wary of that. For the rest, as you see here, I use plenty of pictures from reenactors. They're beautiful. I mean, aesthetically speaking, look at these panoplies. Look at they're very artistic, right? They're beautiful to watch, and we all thank them for making these beautiful reenactments. But let's not attribute to them more than just this kind of show off, because unfortunately I had I don't know whether fortunately or unfortunately as you know, my disappointment in actually with a girl that belonged to this kind of HEMA environment, and I've been so up to that time I was thinking to at least leave the benefit of the doubt. Then when I was introduced to those places, even just looking at the thing, I realized completely that if that is the average, fuck that. And in fact, I didn't get married on that occasion. And so that's also how, strict I can be about these things. But, it's not even because of that. It's because the other person not realizing at all why these things are a problem beyond that. Because if it stopped to just pretending some military competence, which is already a pretty serious thing on its own, it would be one thing. The other, making kind of ideologism, kind of Fort Estater propaganda, kind of this BS of, it's essentially a narcissistic self-promotion. That's where it gets down for most of them. And again, I understand that because you're an actor at the end of the day, but and I've been to places also aside from that in beautiful historical sites where very nice people I've met there. It was fun for the tourists as I went there but eventually I didn't get to know these people personally except on that occasion, and the few times also I've heard other people trying to make points historically, etc. I reconfirmed every time the quite unfortunate impression that I matured over my life in these kind of environments. In any case, here there is a passage from Vegetius 1:12. Again, we're talking about different times, different equipment, but it can't be interesting as far as the classical technique the Romans would use to inflict blows with the gladius. It says, quote, the cutting. The cut, even if inflicted with great force, often is not able to kill, because the vital parts are protected by armor and by the bones. Instead, the tip penetrating just 2 ounces, that is 5 centimeters, and this is true anatomically, provokes mortal wounds. Yes, the human body is something disgustingly weak. Just penetrating a few centimeters into a human torso mostly can't hit important vessels, and again, not maybe killing on the spot, of course, but still inflicting severe wounds. In fact, Vegetsus says if it interests vital organs. Furthermore, when the cut is inflicted, you basically leave unprotected the arm and the right side. So, of course, we think actually even left-handers still fought, still wielded the sword with the right, by the way. But this is not the issue per se. This is just for the sake of the example. While if you inflict, if you thrust, right, the entire body remains covered. So from this, you see, mostly in these recreations, the fact that the blow would come, kind of the thrust would be carried out either above the shields or below, right? So trying again to target in the some of the most important vessels that are left uncovered. It requires an important dynamism during the fight. It can unbalance you if you crouch, you stand up again. It also must be done repeatedly, as you understand. If you want to catch the enemy by surprise, as you understand, this thing was pretty intense. They weren't just watching one another. Everything had to be done quickly, because you could easily parry just with the scutum most of your body. And what is interesting about this all is that when you look at the legionnaire, conceptually, yes, he had to fight in a collective formation, but, for example, the famous kind of cylindrical shape, like kind of, squared but convex shielded, is at least the most popularized of the period. We don't know whether it was even actually prevalent, aside from the propaganda pictures, but conceptually the scutum had always been more or less toward that direction. Naturally shows an important degree of individual combat, meaning that the flat shield, right, that also prevails. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, it's mostly used by the militias. It's mostly used by troops that have to interlock the shields, because if left alone, they're not that performing. Instead, the Roman legionnaire was disciplined, but also quite individualistic-minded still. Again, a few centuries before this were tribal warriors. They were incredibly aggressive and viciously so. And they had all these kind of obsessions, again, with the individual still sense of warriorhood. Romans were fond of decapitations. There was a lot of kind of interesting things that are also depicted in Roman art, and this again kind of individual virtuosism was part of Romanity, just by importing for. These were not just coldly and purely rationalistically disciplined fighters. These were also kind of again disturbingly fanatic individuals, right? They had a sense of themselves, of their personal glory, of their individual destiny, that entailed probably a quite bloodthirsty mentality in many ways that would be manifested on the battlefields also, again, in quite interesting ways. I mean, if you think the same concept of the centurions, of the selection of these troops, you realize that they nurtured each other in a sort of brutal camaraderie that got down to this enormous sense of themselves. And you could have expected a centurion to have legitimately, if he had spent a lifetime in war, to have, in order to have arrived at that point, to have killed by hand at least hundreds of people, also civilians, but the majority surely also being people who would oppose themselves in a kind of dangerous fashion, right? So these would have been quite interesting psychological profiles to analyze, because it turns out historically that there are very few types of mindsets that are able to carry this out practically, right? But we will talk about this in other videos. Now, in a close order, the hits could be inflicted by, as we were saying before, making the gladius pass either above or under the shield, or just on the side to hit the enemy side, so the enemy the enemy right flank, that however would have hit the parts that were better protected on the enemy left side by the shield. So this was perhaps less likely. In any case, everything can happen in combat. The fighters' sides had to be hopefully always adequately protected by his comrades, right? It's what we've seen before about the cohesion of the formation. And this attention could be put into practice and acquired functionally only after the severe and regular collective training. You have to act as one, right? The more cohesive you are, the more chances there are for you to make it out alive. In any case, without the others, your chances are much lower. Not that, again, the Roman legionary is not trained, however, to operate just by default, still as a monad within his own space, and as properly as a swordsman. The shield could notoriously be used not just as a defensive arm, but also as an offensive one. Normally, however, you wouldn't use much the reach of the shield, even though it was normally reinforced to mostly avoid cutting blows, kind of trying to cut through the planks. Yet the umbo most, right? Of course, you could smash the shield just as wood planks into somebody's arm or face or whatever. But the umbo was just, again, in front of you, like just in correspondence of your fist. So it would become kind of natural just to try to punch the enemy in the face with that. The umbo was a metal reinforcement, or a domed one that was properly inserted to prevent that, essentially the part that is close to your shield, but if this had gotten transfixed, would have in fact pierced your hand in some way. It was somehow safe. Again, there was a broader metal structure also on the shield. We'll see at another point. Consider that a scutum weighed 8 kilos, and I don't know if you ever handled the luggage of 8 kilos, and how quickly you would get tired with that. In fact, the scutum between a combat and another would be likely just planted on the ground, because it was exhausting, but it offered a dramatic protection. And there are episodes, for example, in Tacitus Agricola 37, in which you find the Romans hitting the enemies with the shield, and the term used there is exclusively umbo, right? So again, you could really break somebody's feet consistently with a good blow in the face like that, and everything was used in a very dynamic way by anyone, right? And then we have this still kind of post-Vietnam syndrome idea of staticity, of keeping the enemy at a distance, but actually ancient combat, like combat in general, is literally going out there ripping off the guts of a person in front of you with the rage and the necessity of doing that, and passing to the next person wanting to engage, right? So it's not much this kind of mentality that mostly we have as civilians in general, remaining always somehow passive and then see what happens, right? You must aggress, because if you are the stronger one, you just take on the enemy and you just crush him, right? So that's what also the Roman legions were constantly bombarded with psychological, with the idea that they were the chosen race, they had conquered the world, it was stronger, so everyone nobody could stop them, and the successfully achieved objective was to transform these people in literal steamrollers who would have no regard for any trace of human life, and just grabbing what as much as they could from the battlefield, as they knew that, of course, the system would have lavishly rewarded them, at least for the pretty miserable standards of life in the world at the time. Naturally, again, today we do not talk about the legionary training, but we will see how consistent this thing was, in spite of the fact that every army is different. So no Roman legion was ever equal to another. There wasn't, even throughout all Roman history, kind of a full standardization. If you study warfare in general and the homogeneity of civilizations, you know that an army will come out in a way and another in another. They weren't literally the same people, all drawn from the same place with the same mindset. Generally speaking, however, the way to make that artificially was to brutalize them psychophysically to the point that would transform them would first break them and then retransform them in literally other people. And the concept of the initiatory right in the war band to enter this other state was deeply there. The cingulum militaris, that is also what remains throughout all the Middle Ages as probably the indicator of nobility, is laying in the fact that, again, if you can bear arms, if you are a full Roman citizen, you're a fully free person, you have the duty and the privilege to bear arms, you come before other people. The Roman legionnaires had the precedence on the roads. They were distinguished immediately just by the fact that they bore arms. And everybody knew what that kind of person was, what they had gone through, and how dangerous they were. Right? Naturally, there was a kind of civilized standard here. These weren't just maniacs or something, but definitely considering the backgrounds from which they came, again, we're pretty rough people just by extraction, right? These were different people from the officers, from the nobility, the real nobility. I mean, socially speaking, they were there because they were hungry, right? And hungry soldiers, at least not in a literal sense, but because you have to feed them adequately, right? And never fully satisfying them, even in that case, because otherwise they will grow fat and lazy, right? You have to keep them fit, constantly active, constantly after something, right? And that's how you have an empire of the size of Rome. But they have a goal, right? As much as all the other people that joined the Roman army had, and even more than those who were already Roman citizens. So consider that too. In fact, some of the finest troops eventually would come from the just Romanized, newly conquered populations who were still kind of less gentrified than, say, what the Italics gradually became, and so on. And this thing goes on till to this day in terms of how we live and how the world ages and this kind of things. So as we know, the idea that after this first impact, fight transform itself in a sort of multiplicity of individual duels, despite very at least spread idea, especially through movies and other kind of fantasy representation, is not plausible in the first place. I mean, it doesn't happen, right? When things get to that point, basically it's because the unit has already collapsed and people are fleeing rather than fighting. There were naturally situations in which fight could get pretty messy, whatever, but the important was to maintain cohesion at all costs and to functionally be able to take on the fight again. Again, the entire military training was based on this, maintaining a rigid collective discipline. It's literally what made the thing, largely, in practice, right? There were factors that made it in turn, but in terms of what it was necessary to have on the field, it was soldiers that knew perfectly how to move on the field, how to rely on one another, to follow the ensigns, the orders, that would already know what to do beforehand, right? And that's why the Roman legionnaires were trained to build a camp every damn night of March, and all of them had their own spot in the camp, and it would be replicated exactly at that point every single day. It was just like the measure of their devotion, right? And how much they believed in this transfigurational power of the imperial order. In order to exploit the superiority in close combat, it was necessary to maintain also a standard distance, at least depending on the type of tactical situation. There were surely different types of orders that could be alternated. This could be done also in very ad hoc ways and kind of emergential ones, right? However, the legionnaires were trained to open and close order at command. The main functionality was not to hamper the movements, right? Yet maintaining the necessary cohesion of the overall formation, right, to prevent it collapsing. But Vegetius 126 says it explicitly, and it's kind of obvious. Vegetius 3:15, as we were saying before, talks of an interval of fundamentally 3 feet, that is, so 90 centimeters between a fighter and another, right? Which means, in practice, from the front, you have a smaller distance than 30 centimeters between a soldier and another. Again, Polybius says otherwise. Is something of an open order in practice, and this again depends just on the situation. And the reason why we have just these two measures is too speculative just to explain. Just know that in both times these troops were able to switch from open to close order on a regular basis, and that naturally cohesion could still happen, in a broader sense, right? During the battle, during the same combat, it's obvious that legionnaires were not looking at maintaining exactly 19 centimeters, of front, because otherwise things got messed up. However, orientatively speaking, they had an idea of how close they had to be to perform certain actions, and at least this distance of less than 30 centimeters from one another is literally a minimum, because this is basically a phalanx, right? And the 30 centimeters is the space necessary to use the sword with rapid and sudden, at least thrusts, right? So not much even for slashing, which we know was actually carried out by the Romans in Vegetius times, especially with the spatae, even more, right? So when Polybius speaks of a more open order, we look at that, and we also look at, I made a video on the Roman gladius around that period, and we have seen that it wasn't, they were kind of pretty darn good cutting weapons as well. They were longer than they would be in early imperial times, so maybe they needed more space. The Roman Italic legionnaire was perhaps more kind of tribally warlike, so to need more space for evolutive, combat or something like that. We don't know this, right? We just know that the space depends on different things. And as we've seen, the entire formation was somehow flexible, because also in depth there was sufficient space that now, after the charge, had to be closed, especially during combat, immediately, because again, there was a substantial pressure from the posterior ranks also to prevent the first ones from retreating in some way, and again, even the interaction within the same army often must have been quite brutal, right? Surely, always in any battle that you can think of in these times, friendlies killed each other for some reason, not just friendly fire, for which, as we've seen, probably just the very first ranks through the pila at the beginning, some of which without even aiming for precision fire, but literally think somebody wanted to flee, and as it happened up to very recent time, it happens all the time. You see a commander simply kills you on the spot if you're trying to get away, and this kind of things. So again, after the charge, all the imagine this also in terms of that you smash against the enemy while you're running, so you basically stop mostly, and then other people are coming from behind you, and they have to slow down in order to smash into you to just keep pushing in a sense, and much of that moral superiority stands in how much you're just willing to smash through by yourself, right? Consider that the enemies too are smashing on the back of those who are in the front. It's a bit like the Hellenic Otis Moss, except this worked slightly different from an Hellenic classical phalanx. In any case, there were naturally situations in which all this order could not be maintained for a reason or another. For example, rash deployment could bring to a general disorder of the way the units were arrayed, right? To have heterogeneous maneuver space among the units and even among the men. For example, during the Battle of the Sabis River against the Belgians, we're talking about the Commentari de Bello Gallico 225, Caesar says notoriously that he basically salvaged the situation as he ordered, by ordering to the 12th Legion that was being attacked by the Gauls to open the Maniples' order to cope better against with the enemy. This is interesting because sometimes you find it as this was done just in terms of small kind of individual combat kind of reason, but the reason why he did this is that the units that had been deployed there, the Gauls had basically outflanked the Romans on the right, and the 12th Legion had to stamp this attack, but the Maniples were all cramped together. Notice that Caesar talked about Maniples even after the Marian Legion. Of course, it was an effective tactical unit on its own still. This tells us also how this was an issue also internally to the cohort, or we don't know also how this front was really organized. Whether what unit was more important than the other. The cohort was very important, and most of these legions were understrength. But the Maniples correspond properly to the companies, so there is something a bit more, in terms of small unit tactics, kind of more protagonistic about this kind of units of kind of 150 men, can say, or like above 100 if they were understrength. And the point there is that the Romans were pressured by the Gauls that were pressuring their flanks too, right? Because again, the front was unitely narrower than they thought, so the Gauls had taken advantage of that. And Caesar gives the order to, we don't know about the spaces here where the Gauls were, but between an engagement and another, you may have had something like that. Caesar tells that, but we don't know how the thing really went And not that he's unreliable, as people believe that there is this terrible Roman propaganda behind everything that is modifying everything, because there is a terrible conspiracy against the poor barbarians and all this bullshit. But the idea is that probably the front line had to be extended, thus preventing the outflankment. And however, in this sense, making the legionnaires fighting on a longer line, thus with less distance, more distance between one another, which means that even under heavy kind of a heavy attack like this Belgian one really was, and Caesar found Roman legionnaires wounded, giving up, retreating, all these things. So still, these soldiers were properly conceived to engage into hand-to-hand fighting, one-to-one duel, right, on a regular basis, and that the most important thing was not to be outflanked, not to having to face more enemies frontally, right? This is fascinating because, again, the Belgian pressure was very high, lots of wounded, so you would expect if you can't hold the line, you are, if you widen it, it's becoming thinner practically, and instead the main problem was the fact that the various units didn't have the order to operate within the space they were designed for. So that is actually quite eloquent about probably how they were habituated to operate. They weren't scared by fighting with more enemies at a time. They were scared about being outflanked. Psychologically speaking, is correct. We know that units really work like that. And in any case, the superior collective discipline and the also very harsh individual training allowed the Roman legionnaire to prevail in any hand-to-hand engagement against basically any enemy, also in terms of numerical inferiority, on a regular basis, right? You objectively do not find anything better than Roman legionary infantry at this point, right? Cavalry is not decisive. Infantry is still the queen of battles. These are professional troops, properly trained, equipped, motivated. They are a sort of elite, right? But they are also, again, pretty dominating over a much larger amount of people, both what we think like inside and outside the Roman frontier. And most of the enemies basically do not want to face them in open field because they know that they don't have the same tactics. At least they have the same tactics loosely, but not the capacity to perform them the same way the Romans do, right? And that's, again, the indicator of a civilization. Again, this is also a matter of numbers. You see, Roman legions at this point were something like 5,500 men each. They would fight in, so larger numbers. I mean, with multiple legions at a time, plus a complementary auxiliary force of the same number. So we're not talking. We're going to talk about armies in general. We don't have to get to categorical to let me calculate. These are auxiliaries. These are legions. How they cooperate. Everything was put together in some kind of homogeneous way. At least battle lines usually were, and then you could use auxiliaries in different ways and to also support the flanks, whatever. However, the core was the Roman legion, and again, no people at this point had the quality of troops necessary to come to grips with these troops successfully, right? You had to ambush them. You had to put yourself in you wouldn't have to come out in open field. It just per se is a declaration of strategic inferiority, right? You could have, again, disasters like the Teutoburg Forest, all these things. But again, what did eventually the Germans do about that, or what did any other people that, what about after Carrhae? Did the Parthians ruled over the Rome was the hegemonic power that nobody basically could challenge until the world somehow either Romanized or the Roman Empire, declined for internal problems, and no people was ever able to say, okay, now I arrive here and I conquer this place, or I work on something that basically is my civilization, not the Roman one. Never, right? So this was the entirety of the world. So whoever would just stand against this power either was doing it on a frontier area, so far from the core lands of it, where the Romans were also less motivated to fight in the first place, or not much more, right? And at the end of the battle, of course, if the outcome had been victorious, there was actually the bloodiest moment of the day. That is to say, the pursuit of the fleeing enemy. As we were remembering before, battles were pretty bloody, also in combat proper, right? People say, well, but after all, losses in combat seem to have been particularly low, just because they relatively compare it to, to the total of the eventual losses, most of which, again, happen after combat. But if you actually look at the forces engaged, and, you have an idea of more or less how many were fighting for how long during the day, you realize that losses were pretty damn high, even for armies that people say, they were just poking each other, like, I don't know, the Macedonian phalanxes. Look at the losses at the Battle of Raphia, because the sources tell us in combat, we're like 1/10 of the army. It's a monstrous amount for an allegedly kind of passive, static phalanx that was actually something different, evidently. So the task of pursuing the fleeing enemy was usually entrusted to lighter troops. Vegetius 3:14 says expressly light infantry. But it's obvious that cavalry was the most important one, because it was just faster. The important, again, was when the battle line crumbled, like, just as long as the fleeing enemy were still kind of close to the area, just like pursuing them, because you would kill them in large numbers much more quickly and easily. As we were saying before, yes, cavalry is speedier, but again, when the day is lost, you're psychophysically traumatized to the point that there are people who died literally of psychological shock. Plus, consider what it means, like, to lose liquids during the day. Some people died of syncopes. We know that they simply died on the spot like that. And it was a horrifying situation. This was probably the moment in which, also in the mentality of the time, all the deities of war literally would fall on the battlefield to suck the blood out of their prey, right? The deities of the underworld, the dark Dionysian, Chthonic ones, because, of course, the empire, the Apollonian, Uranian, heavenly prize went to the winners. The defeated were killed without achieving transfiguration, and thus their destiny was to be swallowed, destroyed by their souls to be lost properly, devoured by the deities of the underworld and the deities of war, the Furies. There is always a dual imagery here, because again, it's always a female deity, because it embodies the kind of the weaker element, that, however, a victorious hero transfigures into victory herself, and so the heavenly maiden, while that is basically your own soul, that in its lowest elements that you have either to transfigure or to be devoured by, right? And self-destroyed practically. And so in case of defeat, you are just in fact brought in the underworld, in the opposite direction from the sun, from heaven. And okay, let's not digress too much on this, but it's to make you understand how everybody knew that would have happened at the time. And the equivalent, physically speaking, was pretty eloquent about that. We're talking about massive baths of blood, as we're going to look at now. Arian says in his work on prescription, says if the enemy is repelled and a general rout ensues, the infantry line opens and cavalry pursues through the openings. Right, this is interesting because cavalry at this point is also generally thrown as not a single battle line, right, as they would also, because at this time in history they wouldn't engage as such. It's not like during the Middle Ages you have probably a battle line made up of cavalry, right? So this is kind of an open order also to chase the enemy, right? That is broken anyway. It says, but however, there's only not all of it, but only half of it, because it has to be deployed in the front, as it has to pursue the enemy. So naturally, a minimal reserve is important to be kept, because you may not know how many other battle lines there are, whether there is it's an ambush really, as it could happen. Remember that these are general principles for different, say, engagements of different scale, so different things can happen at the same time. Generally speaking, this was the moment of victory would send some forces to chase the enemy. It says the other half follows in order the pursuers without forcing, so that the flight goes on, and they can keep on with the pursuit with fresh horses, while if the defeated reorganize themselves, they can still attack those that can come to fight, right? You know, they can be ready for it. This is important because infantry, as we've seen, was the decisive arm, so cavalry always risked a bit in these pursuit operations after all. And then it says, heavy infantry does not remain on the spot, but he advances at a sustained pace or a slow one, so that if it meets with stronger resistance from the side of the enemy, it can provide to cavalry its own support, for the reason that we just said. I mean, combined arms are always successful, so you could always have, just in every battle you have a body of troops that sacrifice themselves also to allow the others to flee more safely, for reasons of honor fundamentally, and because they're done for politically at home because of the laws, etc. So they still can hope to achieve transfiguration in battle, and setting the examples or saving the names of their clan, their family. But if you attack and these are desperate forces, right? They're not so many to be so dangerous, but they can't hold for a long time for allowing the others to escape. So you can more easily take them out with a combined arm operation. In any case, it's interesting that here, infantry that in part has been spent during the fight is still meant to advance to finish the job. And this is correct, because as far as I've studied in details in medieval battles, many period, you always have this thing that until the last you don't know whether the field is won or not. So you have to cross it, you have to essentially wipe out any form of resistance, you have to finish off the wounded, you have properly to see that nobody else is left, because battlefields extend 4 kilometers at a point, so you just can't see everywhere, and there can be ambushes, things, or other battle lines you may never know. And for this reason, the pursuit translated itself in a ruthless massacre of the defeated. Right? For example, the defeat of the Britons of Boudicca by hand of Suetonius Paulinus, lost, according to Roman sources, this is definitely exaggerated, this is Tacitus, Annals 1437, 80,000 men. Naturally, it would have been a miracle if they had had even 50,000, and some of them would have survived anyway. So, but that was a big slaughter in the first place, with, according to the same source, less than 1,000 fallen Romans, right? Naturally, numbers can be exaggerated, but they give you the scale of how it was. Like, if you managed to break, the Britons did have cavalry and chariots, but mostly they were infantry. So, if they were so thickly, compact in a single place, and they got defeated, they were there to make their last stand. And so it's realistic that the victorious Romans would have suffered some casualties during the battle, but then there would be a massive slaughter after that of the Britons. At the Battle of Mons Graupius, as we've seen, Agricola lost 360 auxiliaries, inflicting more than 10,000 casualties to the Caledonians. This is still Tacitus Agricola 37. I made a video about that. I can also re-upload it at a point. A number equal to 1/3 of the entire Caledonian army, by the way. So this is also substantially realistic in insight. If you look at Hellenic classical battles numbers, you realize that the defeated normally lost something like 1/5 of the troops, compared to a 5% of the winning army. In classical Greece, however, there was less cavalry than in the Roman army. And when you look at these numbers, you could make statistics also in other videos. Hopefully we will treat this, but you realize that the Romans definitely were in a time, the military art, where all arms were developed and interacting to the maximum effect, and so chasing the enemy with their cavalry on a regular basis. The pursuit of the enemy could be carried out for days, like a sort of major hunt, right? And objectively, they did end mostly with the capture or the massacre of the fleeing. Tacitus is somehow explicit in his Annals in 168, 12, 21. And this phase, according to the warlike practice of the ancient world, was very important, also very delicate in a way, because of the loot, right? And the fact that during the same battle, some units would tend to leave their posts to go essentially sack the enemy camp, so distracting themselves from the rest of the battle. Normally this happened with forces that were already spent. They had, say, already a battle line that had won over another, but they were spent, and they decided just to move towards the enemy camp. Again, these battlefields were quite wide, so sometimes you could do that in relative safety. Well, it would have been better for them to come back to the fight, right? Carrying out some flank attack, whatever, or coming back properly to the battle line, so that there would be at least to in the posterior ranks, I mean, because normally, again, battle lines usually neutralized one another. I mean, you could still have, however, these forces from the winning side that could be spent in some way, and they were expected to still contribute to the battle rather than looting. Naturally, if these were mercenaries or people that could simply run away, they didn't have a future in the Roman army, you could have this kind of behavior. But usually the core of the army would maintain an order, discipline. Here we're talking about a time with a state, but especially Bejetius 326 in the 4th century remembers that, quote, Wu pursues essentially foolishly the enemy, while his men are scattered around, ends up to give up the victory that he had already conquered, right? And this is true because sometimes the tides are turned in the meanwhile, and so if you distract yourself from the main engagement, the camps are kilometers away from the place of where combat is taking place. You are definitely just going there, hoping to accumulate the loot as you can, and hoping that things will work better for you after the battle, right? Instead than splitting the loot with somebody else, if there is not a strong leadership and so on. So actually, the Romans had a quite effective way of distributing this. Everything was much more regulated than among other populations, but others were always very serious about the equal split, because they perfectly knew that somebody could be a bit more, I don't know how to say, dishonest, let's put it this way. And it was a grave affront just to take part of something that was not, didn't belong to you by right, considering that these were the troops that had already fought, but there were others, and the battle was still going on. Definitely the battle had not been decided, right? So it was still a gamble after all. Plus, there was always the general risk of ambush, counterattacks carried out by the enemy around, right? Sometimes enemies came to loot the camp, and there were some guards that rejected them. For example, we've seen it at the Battle of Magnesia that the Romans managed to defend their own camp from a Seleucid force that came back to the field and found out that the Romans had won the battle entirely. There was nothing to do; they retreated. Right, so lots of things can happen during these events. That's why the Roman iron discipline was particularly, effective, because it literally inculcated this idea that you couldn't properly have any margin for this autonomous behavior. At least there was a degree of autonomy, but simply you could not do something that was against regulation. Right, and there is an interesting attitude here, because the Romans liked still bold people who managed to succeed, right? But they had understood civilizationally that discipline was more important, and there are instances, for example, at the siege of Gergovia, when Caesar reproaches his legionnaires because he says that they had pushed into the same city while the battle was still being fought outside. And they had engulfed themselves in the city, and yes, they were bold and courageous and brave, but he said, I don't count that as much as discipline. So he didn't want to demoralize them further, because the Roman army had almost been wiped out in that battle, and Caesar relied on this man after all. And things can really go out of hand without even necessarily. There are lots of great victories that maybe came out of simply reckless behavior after all, and after the battle people say, oh, okay, we won, so let's not be jerks in general. With, again, crazy people that, however, still made us won by a degree. But it was important to, however, objectivize this reality and not to simply give free rein to, again, too much liberty initiative. And every legionnaire knew what were the margins, let's say, that they could afford, the boundaries that he had to remain within. And then there was always kind of an extra daring element. The important was still to remain overall within measure, right? For how difficult this is in a war. We know anecdotally that from the Strategicon 1.8, so we're talking about the 6th century, we'll come back talking about the Strategicon at some point. The abandonment of the post to despoil the corpses, this was also done quite frequently, and or to make loot, was punished with death, right? And this happened, consider that by that point there were lots of foreign troops coming also from places that were traditionally about this constant raiding and loot, for which they weren't even paid a salary, because they were just a bunch of savage nomads. They would just be there for the loot, and it wasn't very useful if you were still within like the 6th century Roman army was, so something serious, right? So every time you find these complaints, it's because these things happened, right? These regulations were there because things could get that wrong. And the loot would happen, because the troops wanted that. Many soldiers joined the army also for it, legitimately. Only after the enemy was properly chased off the field and carried out by some units that were appositely entrusted with this task. Thus, the loot was collected in one central place and equally distributed among all the soldiers, according to an ancient tradition. Polybius talks about it in the Histories 5:15, which was, the ancient kind of tribal tradition of redistribution, and this was very important in the Roman army, because, as we will see, there were also some kind of hierarchies here involved, but generally speaking, the soldiers, in order to be that motivated and to be that aware of the manifestation of the Imperium in their actions, required their share, right? And this was a right just of the Roman citizens or Roman freemen, as the legionnaires were. All right, so I think we can stop here as a general, say, premise on Roman combat, what we could get, generally speaking, from the essentials, right? Then eventually we will pass to more complicated things and analyze lots of other aspects, how battle lines interacted with one another, how units could carry out also smaller scale tactics, or these kind of things that are mostly conjectural, right? But we can make some point about that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.